Lieutenant Sarah Miller stepped off the military transport with a quiet determination that made her seem older than her years. The base was buzzing with activity. Soldiers hurried across the tarmac, helicopters roared overhead, and the smell of fuel and machinery hung thick in the air. Sarah had been assigned to one of the busiest Apache helicopter units in the Army, a team responsible for keeping these powerful machines ready for the most dangerous missions. She knew the work would be tough, but she welcomed it. From the moment she arrived, Sarah noticed the energy of the base. Soldiers shouted orders, mechanics moved with precise efficiency, and pilots ran final checks before taking off into the sky. Yet, among all this controlled chaos, there was a subtle tension. Some of the younger soldiers looked at her with barely concealed doubt. They were not used to seeing a woman in a position where skill mattered more than age or gender, and she could feel their eyes following her as she walked through the hangar. Sarah didn't let it bother her. Years of training had taught her to focus on the task, not the opinions of others. She carried her toolbox with careful hands, the weight of responsibility pressing lightly on her shoulders. As she approached the Apache helicopters, she allowed herself a moment to admire them. These machines were incredible, sleek, powerful, and built to withstand extreme conditions. But Sarah's trained eye noticed what many others overlooked. The helicopters were dirty, their metal bodies smudged with dust, oil, and residue from countless missions. A thin layer of grime covered areas that could hide serious wear or damage. Most mechanics would have ignored it, assuming the next inspection would reveal any problems. Not Sarah. She knelt beside the first Apache, running her gloved fingers over the rotor blades and landing gear. Her eyes were sharp, scanning for even the smallest scratches, dents, or loose bolts. To her, cleaning the helicopter wasn't about appearances, it was about safety. Every speck of dirt she removed could mean the difference between a successful mission and disaster. She began wiping the body carefully, using soft cloths to avoid scratching the paint and paying special attention to tiny details that others might miss. As she worked, a few of the young male soldiers gathered nearby, leaning against crates and whispering to one another. "Look at her," one muttered with a smirk. "She's polishing the Apache like it's a show car." "Who does that?" Another chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe she thinks she's in some fancy air museum, not a combat zone." Sarah heard their whispers, felt their eyes on her, but she didn't respond. She had learned long ago that pride and arrogance often mask ignorance. If they were laughing, it only meant they didn't yet understand the value of what she was doing. The more she cleaned, the more she began to notice things others had overlooked. Tiny chips in the armor plating, faint scratches along the rotor shafts, and a slight misalignment on the landing gear. All things that could cause serious problems if ignored. Her mind cataloged each detail, considering how to address them during routine maintenance. She worked methodically, moving from one part of the helicopter to another, never rushing, never cutting corners. Hours passed, and the sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows inside the hangar. Sarah's hands were smudged with grease, and her uniform bore streaks of dust, but she didn't mind. For her, this was the heart of the job. Understanding the machine intimately, respecting its power, and ensuring it could perform perfectly when called upon. She had faced challenges before. Long nights of maintenance, sudden equipment failures, even dangerous environments. But this assignment felt different. Here, she sensed an unspoken challenge. She had to prove her skill, not through words, but through results. Occasionally, she paused to study the Apache as a whole, appreciating how all its parts worked together. It was more than metal and mechanics. It was a finely tuned weapon that depended on human care to remain effective. Sarah felt a quiet pride. This helicopter, this machine that others merely flew or ignored, had become her responsibility. And she intended to honor that responsibility fully. By the time the team took notice of her, she had already finished a significant part of the cleaning. The young soldiers' whispers grew louder, a mixture of amusement and confusion. Some shook their heads, unable to understand why someone would take such care over what they considered routine work. Others watched silently, sensing that there was more to Sarah than met the eye, though they couldn't yet explain why. As she packed up her tools at the end of the day, Sarah looked over the Apache one last time. Its metal gleamed faintly under the hangar lights, every bolt and panel spotless. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. This was just the beginning. She knew that tomorrow, and the days after, would bring inspections, missions, and the watchful eyes of pilots and fellow mechanics. But she was ready, and deep down, she knew that her careful attention today would be remembered, even if no one acknowledged it just yet. Sarah walked out of the hangar, her steps steady and confident. The base was still buzzing with activity, but now, in her mind, there was a sense of calm. She had arrived, she had worked, and she had left her mark. Quiet, unnoticed by most, but perfect in every detail. The story of her dedication was only beginning, and she was determined that when the time came, everyone would see just how much she had done. As the days passed at the base, Sarah Miller settled into her routine with quiet determination. Every morning, she arrived before most of the soldiers, carrying her toolkit like a badge of honor. She moved methodically from one Apache helicopter to another, inspecting, cleaning, and ensuring every part was flawless. For her, this was more than a job. It was a responsibility. Each helicopter represented lives in the air, missions to complete, and trust placed in the hands of those who cared for them. However, not everyone appreciated her dedication. The younger mechanics, mostly male and fresh out of training, could barely hide their skepticism. They whispered behind her back, casting sideways glances that made no effort to be subtle. "She's obsessed with cleaning," one muttered while leaning against a crate. "Does she think the helicopter will fly better if it's shiny?" Another laughed. Their voices carried across the hangar, sharp and mocking, but Sarah pretended not to hear. Despite the mockery, she refused to let it affect her work. She knew the truth. Attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death in the air. The grime she scrubbed away might reveal a tiny crack in a rotor, a misaligned panel, or a worn bolt that could fail mid-flight. What others dismissed as unnecessary fuss, she understood as essential. One afternoon, as Sarah worked on the Apache she had been assigned, the laughter and teasing grew louder. A group of young mechanics gathered near her, smirking and making jokes. "Hey, Lieutenant Miller, careful. Don't polish it too much, or it'll blind the pilot," one shouted, drawing chuckles from the rest. Another added, "What's next? Are you going to paint it pink and put flowers on it?" Sarah paused for a moment, her hands still on the rotor shaft, and simply smiled politely. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. She had learned long ago that proving her skill through confrontation was useless. Actions spoke louder than words. She returned to her work, wiping down the fuselage with steady, precise motions. The laughter continued in the background, but she had long since trained herself to focus amid distractions. While she cleaned, she noticed small details that no one else had bothered to see. Tiny streaks of oil along the rotor blades, faint scratches on the armor plating, and a barely visible patch near the cockpit. A mark she recognized from her training, stood out clearly once the dirt was removed. Sarah knew the patch's significance, but she kept it in mind for later. For now, her priority was the helicopter itself, ensuring it was as safe and reliable as possible. As the day wore on, the mockery began to wear on some of the younger soldiers. They didn't understand why she took so much time with what they considered routine work. In their eyes, she was overthinking, overdoing, and overcomplicating a simple cleaning task. But to Sarah, each careful motion was deliberate, each wipe purposeful. She was not just polishing. She was inspecting, preserving, and preparing the machine for the harsh realities it might face. A few of the soldiers started to notice the difference between Sarah's work and theirs. Their own helicopters had smudges they ignored, minor damages that went unrecorded, and parts that were left lightly cleaned at best. Sarah's Apache, by contrast, gleamed under the hangar lights. Every panel was spotless, every bolt checked, and every mechanical detail accounted for. Some of the soldiers exchanged confused glances, unable to understand how someone could take such care over what they thought was mundane. One of the more experienced mechanics, Sergeant Daniels, finally spoke up. "Miller, why do you spend so much time on the small stuff?" he asked, genuinely curious, though there was a hint of amusement in his voice. Sarah looked at him calmly, her hands still moving across the rotor. "Because the small stuff becomes the big stuff if you ignore it," she replied simply. "A tiny misalignment or a hidden crack can bring down the entire machine. I can't afford to overlook anything." Her words hung in the air, a quiet challenge to those who had been mocking her. While some of the younger soldiers rolled their eyes, others started paying attention. Slowly, they began to understand that her meticulousness was not unnecessary. It was necessary. They couldn't see the immediate results yet, but there was a sense that Sarah's work had a purpose beyond simple cleanliness. By the end of the day, the atmosphere around the hangar had subtly shifted. The teasing continued, but it was less confident, less certain. Some of the soldiers even watched her silently, curiosity mixed with respect. Sarah didn't seek recognition, but she could sense that, slowly, her dedication was making an impression. As she packed her tools and stepped out of the hangar, Sarah took one last look at the Apache she had worked on. The helicopter gleamed, every panel and rotor polished and checked. She knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, inspections, missions, and the watchful eyes of pilots who relied on her expertise. But for now, she felt a quiet satisfaction. She had done her work well, with care, precision, and integrity, even if no one fully understood it yet. In the days that followed, the whispers and mockery continued, but Sarah's calm confidence remained unshaken. She had learned that respect was earned through action, not words, and that patience was as important as skill. She knew that one day, when it truly mattered, the very details she insisted on would make all the difference, and those who had mocked her would see the value of her work. The day of the routine flight inspection arrived, and the base was alive with activity. Soldiers moved quickly, checking equipment, loading supplies, and preparing for the tests that would ensure each helicopter was ready for action. Sarah Miller arrived early, as always, carrying her tools and a notebook filled with observations from her inspections over the past few days. She was focused, calm, and ready to make sure that the Apache she had worked on was not only clean but safe in every possible way. The young mechanics who had mocked her earlier were busy with their own helicopters, their conversations filled with jokes and laughter. A few glanced her way, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Sarah didn't notice. Her attention was entirely on her work. She moved along the Apache, checking bolts, rotor blades, hydraulic lines, and panels, following a precise sequence she had memorized from years of training. Every movement was deliberate, every check meticulous. While the other soldiers hurried through their inspections, sometimes skipping steps, Sarah worked slowly and methodically. She knew that even a small oversight could be dangerous. A loose bolt here, a worn cable there, small problems that others might ignore, could lead to disaster in the air. Her notebook was filled with notes, measurements, observations, and reminders for future maintenance. She carefully compared each detail with the helicopter's maintenance logs, ensuring nothing had been overlooked. The pilot assigned to test the Apache that day, Captain James Reynolds, was confident but impatient. He had flown countless missions, trusted his machine, and assumed the inspection would be routine. When he arrived at the hangar, he nodded at the other mechanics, expecting the usual quick checks. But he noticed Sarah carefully wiping down the cockpit, checking every gauge, and inspecting small panels others had barely glanced at. He raised an eyebrow, curious about her thoroughness, but he didn't say anything. As the inspection began, Sarah guided the team through each step, pointing out small details that required attention. She demonstrated the proper way to check the rotor alignment, the hydraulic pressure, and the functionality of the weapon systems. Some of the younger soldiers rolled their eyes, thinking it was unnecessary instruction, but they followed along, unable to dismiss her knowledge completely. Then came the moment to examine a small, almost hidden patch near the cockpit, a mark that had gone unnoticed by most of the team. Sarah had carefully cleaned around it days before, preserving its integrity. She knew its significance, but she said nothing, letting the inspection proceed naturally. The other mechanics glanced at it briefly and moved on, unaware of what it meant. Sarah's heart pounded slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. She knew that when the pilot noticed it, the situation would change drastically. Captain Reynolds climbed into the cockpit, preparing for the test flight. He went through his checklist methodically, as he always did, running gauges, testing controls, and feeling the responsiveness of the machine. Sarah watched quietly, her hands resting on the edge of the cockpit. She didn't interfere. Her work was done, and now it was up to the pilot to notice what others had missed. As the helicopter engines roared to life, Reynolds' eyes caught something glinting near the fuselage. It was the patch, subtle but unmistakable once the grime was removed. His expression froze for a moment. Sarah felt a flicker of satisfaction but kept her posture neutral. She had known this moment might come, but she remained calm, letting the pilot process what he had seen. The patch was not just any marking, it signified a rare combat certification. Helicopters bearing this mark had been through intense missions, often in dangerous and life-threatening situations. Few soldiers and even fewer pilots truly understood its meaning. Reynolds recognized it instantly. His face stiffened, a mixture of surprise and respect washing over him. He realized that the meticulous care Sarah had taken with the helicopter had preserved this important detail, something that could easily have been overlooked or damaged. Wordlessly, he radioed his team to prepare for the flight. There was a noticeable shift in his tone, serious, precise, and alert. The other mechanics, who had been laughing and teasing Sarah just days ago, suddenly sensed that something was different. They watched the pilot carefully, noticing the change in his demeanor, but they didn't understand why. Sarah remained quiet, letting the situation unfold naturally. She didn't need their understanding yet. The results spoke for themselves. The test flight began, and the Apache lifted smoothly into the sky. Every control responded perfectly, every system functioned as it should. The pilot's confidence in the machine was evident, and it was clear that the meticulous inspection had paid off. Back on the ground, the mechanics could see the helicopter perform flawlessly, and a quiet respect began to grow in the hangar. Sarah packed her tools with the same calm precision she had shown all day. She didn't boast or seek recognition, but inside, she felt a quiet pride. Her careful attention to detail had made a difference, even if the others hadn't fully realized it yet. She knew that this day would be remembered, not for the jokes, not for the teasing, but for the moment when skill, dedication, and quiet diligence had ensured that the machine was ready for the challenges ahead. As she stepped out of the hangar, the sun reflected off the polished metal of the Apache. It gleamed not just because it was clean, but because someone had cared enough to ensure it was safe and ready. Sarah walked away, confident that her work would soon speak louder than words, and that those who doubted her would begin to understand the true value of her expertise. The morning sun streamed into the hangar, casting long golden shadows across the Apache helicopters lined up for inspection. Sarah Miller moved among them with calm precision, her hands gloved and steady as she checked every bolt, every panel, and every rotor. Today felt different somehow. A quiet anticipation hummed in the air, though Sarah didn't let herself be distracted by it. She focused entirely on her task, carefully cleaning and inspecting her assigned helicopter. Captain James Reynolds, the pilot scheduled to test the Apache that day, arrived with his usual confidence, expecting another routine inspection. He was used to machines being ready for flight, but he had also learned not to rush, trusting that the mechanics had done their jobs. What he didn't expect, however, was Sarah Miller. She moved with an unusual combination of calm and purpose, her eyes scanning details that most mechanics ignored. As Sarah wiped down the helicopter, her attention fell on a small, almost hidden patch near the cockpit. It had been covered with grime and oil, nearly invisible to anyone who wasn't looking carefully. She had noticed it weeks ago but had been careful to clean around it without disturbing it. Her training and experience had taught her the importance of such details, especially in a combat helicopter like the Apache. The patch wasn't just a piece of cloth or a decorative mark. It was a symbol of something far more significant, something few people outside special forces could recognize. Sarah continued her work as the pilot climbed into the cockpit. Reynolds went through his pre-flight checks, running gauges and testing controls, not yet noticing what Sarah had preserved so meticulously. The hangar was filled with the low hum of engines and quiet chatter from other soldiers, most of whom were still laughing about her obsessive cleaning. But Sarah paid no attention. She knew that sometimes the world didn't immediately understand dedication. Then, as Reynolds leaned over the control panel, his eyes caught a glint near the fuselage. He froze. His gaze sharpened, and he leaned closer, tilting his head to get a better view. The patch was there, subtle and precise, almost hidden until the grime had been removed. And now, cleaned and preserved by Sarah's careful hands, it was fully visible. Reynolds' reaction was immediate. His expression stiffened, his usual calm confidence replaced by a mixture of shock and respect. He recognized the patch instantly. It was a symbol used exclusively by elite combat units. Helicopters that carried this mark had been through high-risk missions, battles that required precision, skill, and courage. Few machines had earned it, and even fewer pilots had encountered it in person. Seeing it now, preserved perfectly, made Reynolds understand something vital. The meticulous attention Sarah had given to the helicopter was not frivolous. It was essential. The hangar seemed to grow quiet as Reynolds' eyes continued to study the patch. He realized that Sarah's work had kept the marking intact, a detail that could have easily been damaged or overlooked during routine maintenance. He suddenly understood the depth of her skill, the patience, and the knowledge required to notice something so subtle and recognize its importance. Every movement she had made, every wipe of the cloth, every careful inspection. It had all led to this moment. Some of the young mechanics, who had been mocking Sarah just days ago, began to notice the change in the pilot's behavior. They saw him tense slightly, his eyes widening, and a deep respect forming in the way he moved. They didn't yet understand what he had seen, but they could sense that something important had happened. The laughter and teasing that had filled the hangar began to fade, replaced by curious silence. Sarah watched calmly, letting the pilot absorb what he had discovered. She didn't speak, didn't offer explanations. Her confidence was quiet but undeniable. She knew that recognition often came silently, through moments like this, when the skill and care she had invested became apparent. She had spent years training for this level of precision, knowing that attention to the smallest detail could save lives and ensure mission success. Reynolds finally straightened in the cockpit, his face composed but his mind clearly processing what he had seen. The helicopter, once just another machine in the hangar, now carried a weight of history and achievement that was impossible to ignore. Sarah had preserved that history with her diligence, and the pilot understood it immediately. The other soldiers in the hangar began to murmur quietly, realizing that the pilot's stiffened expression was not random. Whispers spread as they pieced together that something remarkable had been uncovered. Even the younger mechanics, who had laughed at Sarah's careful cleaning, could no longer dismiss her. There was a skill, an expertise, and a deep understanding of the aircraft that they had underestimated. As the helicopter engines roared to life for the test flight, Reynolds moved with precision, every control responding perfectly. The patch glinted subtly in the sunlight, a testament to the meticulous care that Sarah had given it. In that moment, the pilot's respect for her was complete, unspoken but unmistakable. He now knew that the woman he had underestimated was not only skilled but invaluable. Sarah stepped back, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the hangar's doorway, watching the Apache lift into the sky. Her work had spoken for itself. The patch, once hidden, now told a story of courage, experience, and meticulous care. Everything she had dedicated herself to. And though the young soldiers still observed her with curiosity, they would never forget this moment. The moment when the pilot's reaction made clear that her skill was extraordinary, and her attention to detail could not be questioned. Captain James Reynolds sat in the cockpit, staring at the patch Sarah Miller had uncovered with a mixture of shock and respect. His eyes narrowed as he took in the symbol, a mark he recognized immediately from his training and experience. It was not a decoration, not a simple insignia, but a rare symbol reserved for elite combat units. Helicopters bearing this mark had been part of high-risk missions, where only the most skilled pilots and crews could operate successfully. Seeing it now, fully visible and carefully preserved, made him realize something profound. The woman who had cleaned this Apache had more skill and understanding than most soldiers he had worked with in years. For a moment, Reynolds didn't move. The hum of the engines around him seemed distant, as if the hangar itself had grown quiet to let him process what he was seeing. His hands hovered over the controls, but his mind was elsewhere, analyzing every detail Sarah had preserved. He knew immediately that her careful work was not about pride or showmanship. It was precision, attention to detail, and genuine expertise. Every clean panel, every polished rotor blade, every bolt checked meticulously had contributed to this moment. Outside the cockpit, Sarah stood quietly, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the Apache. She had expected this reaction. She had spent years learning to anticipate problems, to notice what others missed, and to act before it was too late. But even so, there was a quiet satisfaction in seeing the pilot, a man she respected deeply, recognize her work without a single word from her. Reynolds' gaze lingered on the patch, and his stiffened posture betrayed a mixture of pride, surprise, and sudden respect. He knew that Sarah's attention to detail had preserved something critical. Had the patch been damaged, overlooked, or ignored, the history and integrity of the helicopter could have been lost. More importantly, the careful work she had done ensured that the helicopter remained perfectly safe for flight, a factor he could not underestimate. The young soldiers who had been mocking Sarah just days ago watched in stunned silence. They had followed her work with casual amusement, whispering jokes and shaking their heads at what they thought was unnecessary fuss. Now, seeing the pilot's reaction, they could sense that something significant had occurred. They didn't yet understand all the details, but the look on Reynolds' face was unmistakable. This was not ordinary praise. This was acknowledgement of skill, expertise, and rare insight. For Reynolds, the realization came in a rush. He remembered past missions, moments when a small oversight could have led to disaster. He thought about the times he had flown helicopters that were not properly maintained, relying on luck and experience to carry him through. Now, sitting in Sarah's meticulously cared for Apache, he understood the value of someone who went beyond routine checks, someone who treated every detail as vital. Her work was not just cleaning, it was preparation, prevention, and protection. He spoke finally, his voice low but firm, addressing the mechanics nearby. "This isn't just any helicopter," he said, gesturing toward the patch. "This machine has been through serious combat operations. The work that's been done here by her is what makes it safe to fly. Every bolt, every panel, every detail. It matters. She has ensured that this Apache is ready for anything." The hangar fell silent. The younger soldiers, who had laughed and whispered, now looked at Sarah with new eyes. Respect, tempered with awe, began to replace their earlier mockery. They saw that her actions had not been excessive or obsessive, they had been essential. The pilot's acknowledgement gave their doubts no weight, and their curiosity shifted to admiration. Sarah remained calm, letting the moment pass naturally. She didn't seek recognition, nor did she boast. For her, the work itself had always been enough. Yet, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The pilot's reaction confirmed what she already knew. Attention to detail, patience, and expertise could never be replaced by speed or casual effort. Her diligence had saved the helicopter from potential oversight and preserved a piece of history that few would ever notice. Reynolds' respect was evident not just in words, but in the way he moved and spoke afterward. He addressed the team with precision, treating the helicopter as a vital piece of equipment that demanded respect and care. Every instruction he gave reflected his understanding that Sarah's work had made a difference. He had been taught to value skill, yes, but this went beyond training. It was insight, experience, and careful observation. The young soldiers began asking questions, tentatively at first, about what Sarah had done, why it mattered, and how they could improve their own work. Her calm explanations and demonstrations turned what had been a source of ridicule into a learning opportunity. For the first time, they saw her not as a woman polishing a machine, but as an expert whose knowledge could make a real difference in life and death situations. By the time the inspection and test flight concluded, the atmosphere in the hangar had changed completely. Sarah's work had earned not just the pilot's respect, but the attention and curiosity of everyone around her. The quiet mockery that had followed her days ago had transformed into a subtle but undeniable acknowledgement of her skill. As Reynolds climbed down from the cockpit, he approached Sarah and nodded, a gesture filled with unspoken respect. It was the kind of acknowledgement that spoke louder than words, the kind that told everyone in the hangar that she had proven herself in a way that no amount of teasing or disbelief could undo. Sarah smiled faintly, returning his nod with the same quiet dignity. She knew that the work she had done, the patience she had exercised, and the care she had given would resonate far beyond this single day. The pilot's reaction was only the beginning. Soon, her colleagues would understand that true skill, patience, and meticulous attention to detail could not be ignored, even in a world filled with doubt and mockery. After the pilot's reaction to the hidden patch, the atmosphere at the base began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first. Sarah Miller moved through the hangar with the same quiet focus she always had, cleaning and inspecting the Apache helicopters. But now the whispers that had followed her began to change tone. Where there had once been mockery and doubt, there was now curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of respect. Some of the younger mechanics, who had laughed at her meticulousness, now watched her work with quiet attention, trying to understand what they had been missing. It wasn't immediate and it wasn't loud. No one came rushing to her side to apologize or declare her the best mechanic at the base. Respect, Sarah knew, was earned slowly, through repeated demonstrations of skill, knowledge, and reliability. And that's exactly what she was doing, methodically, patiently, and without seeking recognition. The base commander, Colonel Adams, had been observing the morning's events from a distance. He had seen the way Captain Reynolds had stiffened when he noticed the patch, had noticed the subtle shift in the hangar's energy, and had finally decided it was time to acknowledge Sarah's work officially. He approached her quietly, watching as she wiped down the rotor blades with steady, practiced motions. "Lieutenant Miller," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "your work has not gone unnoticed. The level of care and expertise you've shown is exceptional." Sarah paused, setting her cloth down and nodding politely. She had never sought praise, but hearing it from the commanding officer was a confirmation of something she already knew. Diligence, skill, and attention to detail mattered, even when others failed to recognize them at first. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. Her words carried no arrogance, only humility. Word of the commander's acknowledgement spread quickly through the hangar. Soldiers who had once mocked Sarah now approached her with a mixture of curiosity and tentative respect. "How did you notice that patch?" one young mechanic asked, his tone cautious, almost reverent. Another added, "I've never thought to clean the cockpit that carefully. How do you even see what's important?" Sarah smiled faintly, recognizing the genuine desire to learn behind their questions. She explained patiently, showing them how small details could have big consequences. She emphasized that maintenance wasn't just about keeping a helicopter clean or operational. It was about ensuring safety, readiness, and reliability in situations where lives depended on every bolt and panel. As she worked alongside them, demonstrating techniques and answering questions, she noticed a change in their demeanor. The soldiers who had once whispered and laughed now followed her instructions carefully, listening to her explanations with genuine interest. Some even began adopting her meticulous methods in their own work, checking twice and cleaning thoroughly, realizing that the smallest detail could matter more than they had ever imagined. Even the most skeptical soldiers started to show subtle signs of admiration. They watched how Sarah approached each task with calm determination, how she never rushed, and how her focus never wavered despite the noise and distractions of the hangar. Her skill was undeniable, and her dedication was contagious. Slowly but surely, she became a quiet leader in her own right, not by commanding authority, but by inspiring respect through action. Captain Reynolds, who had been observing this shift closely, began to rely on Sarah more frequently. He consulted her before flights, asking for her insights on the condition of each helicopter. He trusted her judgment implicitly, knowing that the careful inspections she performed could mean the difference between success and disaster during missions. Sarah had earned his professional respect, and with it, her influence among the team grew. The younger mechanics started to understand something crucial. Mockery and assumptions were temporary, but skill and diligence were permanent. They began to emulate her, asking questions, taking more care in their inspections, and learning the subtleties that Sarah had mastered through years of experience. In time, the Hangar's culture began to change subtly, with careful attention and pride in one's work becoming more valued than speed or casual effort. Despite all the recognition and respect she was beginning to receive, Sarah remained grounded. She continued her work as she always had, cleaning, inspecting, and maintaining each helicopter with the same meticulous care. Her satisfaction came not from praise or acknowledgement but from knowing that the machines under her care were safe, ready, and reliable. She understood that true respect was earned over time and that her actions spoke louder than words. By the end of the week, the transformation in the hangar was clear. Soldiers who had once doubted her now sought her advice. Mechanics of all ages came to her for guidance, and the younger pilots began to see her as an indispensable part of the team. Sarah had changed not just the appearance of the helicopters but the culture surrounding their care. Her dedication had become a standard that others aspired to reach, a quiet but powerful influence that left a lasting mark on everyone around her. As she finished her day, wiping the final panels of the Apache and checking each rotor blade one last time, Sarah allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The machines were ready, the team was learning, and her work had begun to leave a legacy of professionalism and care. She knew that challenges would continue to come, that skepticism might rise again, and that her work was never truly done. But for now, she felt a quiet pride in knowing that the respect she had earned was real, hard-won, and lasting. Earned not through words, but through skill, patience, and unwavering dedication. The days following the pilot's reaction and the commander's acknowledgement marked a quiet transformation at the base. Sarah Miller's presence, once met with whispers and ridicule, had begun to carry weight among the soldiers. Her reputation for meticulous work and unwavering focus spread not through gossip, but through observation, through the results of her diligence that everyone could see. The Apache helicopters she cared for were cleaner, safer, and better maintained than any others on the base. Even the most skeptical soldiers had started to approach her differently. Instead of teasing or mocking, they now asked questions, watched carefully, and followed her methods. The hangar, which had once been filled with casual laughter at her expense, now had an air of respect and quiet attention whenever she worked. Mechanics and pilots alike began to realize that Sarah's skills were not just impressive, they were essential. Colonel Adams, the base commander, had noticed the shift as well. He observed how the soldiers, young and old, responded to her guidance, and he recognized the rare quality of leadership that came not from rank or words, but from expertise and integrity. One afternoon, he approached her quietly as she worked on an Apache's rotor blades. "Lieutenant Miller," he said, his tone measured but approving, "your work has set a standard for this unit. I want you to know that your dedication is changing the way our soldiers approach their tasks." Sarah looked up, setting her tools down briefly, and nodded politely. She didn't seek praise, but it was hard to hide a small, satisfied smile. She knew that her work had always mattered, even when others didn't see it, and now, finally, the results were being recognized. "Thank you, sir," she replied softly, her voice calm, steady. "I just focus on making sure the helicopters are ready for the pilots. That's all that matters." As the days went on, more and more soldiers came to her for guidance. A young mechanic approached hesitantly, holding a checklist in his hand. "Lieutenant Miller, I'm not sure I understand this step. Could you show me the proper way to check the rotor alignment?" Sarah smiled and nodded, walking him through the process carefully, explaining why each step mattered and what to look for. She demonstrated with patience, allowing him to try under her supervision, correcting gently when necessary. Her influence grew quietly but steadily. The soldiers began to adopt her methods, checking details they had previously ignored, cleaning panels thoroughly, and double-checking every bolt and panel. Even pilots started consulting her before flights, asking for her opinion on the readiness of their helicopters. Sarah's meticulousness, once mocked, had become the benchmark for quality and safety. Captain Reynolds continued to rely on her expertise. He knew that a helicopter maintained under Sarah's watchful eye was more than just operational. It was trusted. Her diligence ensured that every panel, every rotor, and every system had been carefully examined, reducing the risk of mechanical failures in the field. He respected her judgment and began speaking highly of her to other pilots, further cementing her reputation among the crew. The young soldiers who had once mocked her found themselves learning not just technical skills but also a lesson in humility and respect. They observed how quiet confidence, combined with skill and dedication, commanded attention more effectively than words ever could. Sarah never demanded recognition, yet she earned it fully through her consistent excellence. One day, as Sarah finished an inspection and wiped the last bit of grease from a rotor blade, a group of mechanics approached her together. "Lieutenant Miller," one of them said, his tone respectful. "We've been following your methods for a week now and we see the difference. We want to thank you for showing us the right way to do things." The others nodded in agreement, and even the most hesitant among them offered a small smile of acknowledgement. Sarah simply nodded back. She didn't need their thanks. Seeing them take pride in their work and understanding the importance of careful maintenance was enough. She had changed not just the appearance of the helicopters, but the attitude and mindset of the team around her. The hangar now operated with a level of professionalism and respect that hadn't existed before. By the end of the week, the change was undeniable. The helicopters were not just clean, they were pristine, every detail carefully examined and maintained. The soldiers who had once questioned her methods were now teaching what they had learned from her to new recruits, perpetuating a culture of diligence and respect. Sarah's influence had created a ripple effect that went far beyond a single hangar or a single team. Sarah looked over the Apache one last time before leaving for the day. It gleamed under the base lights, every bolt secure, every panel polished, every detail accounted for. She allowed herself a quiet moment of satisfaction, knowing that her work had made a tangible difference, not just in the machines themselves, but in the people around her. The respect she had earned was not loud or flashy, but it was real, enduring, and well-deserved. As she walked out of the hangar, the sun setting behind the mountains, Sarah knew that her dedication had left a lasting impact. The soldiers around her had learned a valuable lesson. Skill, patience, and attention to detail were more powerful than mockery or doubt. And though her work would continue quietly every day, its effects would be felt long after she left, shaping the standards of the base for years to come. The weeks turned into months, and life at the base settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and demanding. Sarah Miller continued her work with the same calm precision she always had, inspecting and maintaining each Apache helicopter with unwavering focus. The machines gleamed under her care, every panel spotless, every bolt secure, and every system ready for action. But her work now carried more than the responsibility of machinery. It had become a symbol of dedication and excellence for the entire team. Sarah had earned the respect of the pilots, the mechanics, and even the new recruits who arrived at the base. They watched her closely, learned from her methods, and began to adopt her attention to detail in their own work. What had once been mockery and skepticism had transformed into admiration and quiet reverence. Her influence extended beyond the hangar, shaping a culture of professionalism, pride, and care for every helicopter. Despite this recognition, Sarah remained humble. She never sought praise or acknowledgement. Her satisfaction came from knowing that the helicopters under her care were ready to perform at their best, keeping pilots safe and missions successful. Yet, even without seeking it, her legacy was growing. The young soldiers who had once whispered and laughed now shared her lessons with others, ensuring that her methods and values would endure long after she moved on. One afternoon, Captain James Reynolds approached her with a serious look. He had just returned from a particularly challenging mission, and he wanted to personally thank her for the role she played in ensuring his helicopter had performed flawlessly. "Lieutenant Miller," he said, his tone respectful and sincere, "the work you do doesn't just keep the helicopters running, it keeps us alive. I want you to know that every flight I take, I trust these machines because of you." Sarah smiled faintly, feeling the weight of his words without letting it alter her calm demeanor. "Thank you, Captain," she replied. "I just make sure everything is ready. The rest is in your hands." She didn't exaggerate her role. She understood that trust was mutual. Her work prepared the helicopter, but the pilot's skill carried it through the mission. The young mechanics watched this exchange, absorbing not just the words, but the respect and gratitude that flowed naturally from experience and understanding. For them, it was a lesson far deeper than any technical manual could teach. Excellence and diligence command respect, not arrogance or self-promotion. Sarah had shown them that true leadership often comes quietly, through consistent effort and integrity. As the sun set over the base, casting long shadows across the hangar, Sarah finished her final inspection of the day. She moved slowly, deliberately, making sure each rotor, panel, and instrument was perfect. Her eyes lingered on the Apache she had first been assigned months ago, the one that had sparked the pilot's reaction and changed the team's perception of her. The helicopter gleamed, a symbol of her care, patience, and skill. She thought back to the first day she had arrived at the base, when young soldiers had mocked her for cleaning the Apache. At that moment, she had focused only on the work itself, knowing that skill and attention to detail would speak louder than words. Now, seeing how far the team had come, she felt a quiet pride. Not pride in recognition, but pride in knowing that her example had inspired change. The hangar was no longer just a place of machinery. It had become a place where dedication, respect, and excellence were valued above all else. Sarah's influence extended beyond maintenance. She had become a mentor, a quiet teacher whose lessons were learned through observation and action rather than instruction alone. Recruits and seasoned soldiers alike had come to understand that the small things mattered: the careful cleaning of a panel, the precise tightening of a bolt, the preservation of a patch that carried history and significance. Every detail contributed to the larger mission, and Sarah had taught them that through her own example. Even Captain Reynolds continued to rely on her insights. He would consult her before missions, asking for her assessment of the helicopters and trusting her judgment implicitly. In many ways, Sarah had become the unseen backbone of the unit, the person whose diligence ensured that each flight was as safe and effective as possible. Her influence was quiet but undeniable, and it shaped the team's approach to every mission and every task. As the base lights dimmed and the last helicopters were secured for the night, Sarah paused and looked around the hangar. She saw the soldiers moving with a new level of professionalism, the machines shining under her care, and the sense of pride and respect that had replaced doubt and mockery. She knew that her work would continue, day after day, but she also knew that her example had left a lasting mark. The lessons she had imparted through action would endure, shaping the standards and culture of the base for years to come. Sarah walked out of the hangar, her steps calm and measured, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had done her duty well. She had transformed not just machines but people, teaching them, inspiring them, and setting a standard that would not be forgotten. The Apache helicopters she had cared for would continue to perform flawlessly in missions, a testament to her skill and dedication. And the soldiers who had once doubted her would carry her lessons forward, ensuring that excellence, patience, and integrity would remain at the heart of their work. In the end, Sarah's legacy was clear. She had turned mockery into respect, skepticism into admiration, and careful attention into life-saving results. Her story was not just about a woman cleaning a helicopter. It was about skill, dedication, and the quiet power of excellence. And though the base would continue its daily rhythm, every flight, every mission, and every soldier carried with them the mark of her influence, unseen but undeniable, just like the patch she had preserved so carefully all those months ago.